All right, everybody, thank you for joining me on our webinar for today. The topic for today is avoiding common pitfalls when implementing an OEMS or integrated management system. My name is Francisco Soto. That's me there in that picture on top. I don't like pictures of just myself, so I figured I'd include one with my 2-year-old daughter, Elise. And I'm the manager for operational excellence within our company, Wilson Perumal & Company. Some of you might not be familiar with our firm. We are a boutique consultancy that specializes in strategic and operational issues, primarily those rooted in issues of complexity. You're going to hear me talk quite a bit about complexity today. That's what we really focus on. That's one of the things that we believe is a key issue facing companies today. And I will be joined by Barb van Noord. Barb is a retired former director of operational excellence for Suncor Energy. She also used to work for ExxonMobil and Imperial Oil and has about 30 years of experience in oil and gas, along with experience developing and implementing operational excellence management systems within some of those companies. So it's a pleasure to have her joining us today. She's one of the foremost experts in this field, but she also happens to be one of my favorite clients that I've had the pleasure of working with. Barb, I can always count on her to ask me the tough questions, to push me to improve as much as I can. And one of the things that I admire about Barb is her candor and openness and honesty. For when we're talking about a topic like today's about how to avoid pitfalls, it's important to do so with an open mind. And Barb's never been one to tell me to hold back and telling me when I've made a mistake, but she also is one who's open and honest about when she's made a mistake, and that's really important for our topic today. And while Barb no longer speaks for any of her former employees, I think this speaks volumes about her and the culture at those organizations, in that they are more concerned with getting it right than in looking perfect. So I want to thank Barb for coming on today and joining us, and we will be speaking with her shortly. The format for today is a question and answer format. I've got some questions prepared, and we'll be using some questions that we get from the attendees as we go, and we'll get to know what Barb thinks about how to properly implement a management system. But before we do that, we need to get some alignment around management systems in general, and primarily with starting with, why do we even need a management system? Now, if you're attending this webinar, you've likely at least heard of management systems. You've heard about them being a good thing, but chances are that we believe that they're important for different reasons. And it's important for us to align on why we really need management systems in today's environment, because if we have different understandings of why we need management systems, then we're going to come to a different conclusion on what a good management system looks like and how to properly implement one. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about this, and in order to really understand this, we need to first change the way we look at companies and simplify that view down to its more fundamental level. At the most fundamental level, every company is made up of 3 components. They have processes that are carried out by people and equipment. And it's important for us to understand because, first of all, it helps us cut through the clutter and gain a clear understanding of companies, but it also helps us understand what has changed. If you think back a few years ago, a few decades ago, companies used to be a lot more simple. The processes, people, and equipment and the way they interacted used to be very simple. If you think back, companies didn't used to have that as many employees as they do today. The processes that they used to be very simple and with very few variables involved or variations of that process. And certainly the equipment we used to use was much simpler. Today the world has changed, and that's no longer the case. And the biggest implication is how those things interact. And one way that we can look at this is through an example. So I want you to imagine with me a very simple organization. Imagine that it's an organization, maybe just has 1 or 2 products, a few people, one location, and we want to grow this organization. So we're going to add some products, and along with adding products, we're going to seek out more customers. We're also going to seek to probably expand into other markets to grow that way. Well, as we do that, we need to add more people. More products means we probably need to add more processes or more variations to our processes. And likely we need to add more equipment, if not more sophisticated equipment, to keep up with demand. But on top of that, we also need to add more documents. Now we have more processes, more people, more products. We need to document all of that. We'll likely encounter more regulation as well, especially if we're expanding into different markets. We will likely utilize more technology and have many different ways of communicating. So what's happened is now we've added more things to the system. But not only have we added more things, these things also change over time. If you think about, regulation gets far more stringent over time. I don't remember the last time that a law was significantly simplified or deleted. Technology certainly has become far more complicated to deal with. And I think just simply the way that we interact and communicate with our customers, our supply chain partners, our employees used to just be pick up the telephone or see them in person. Now there's a number of different ways that we can communicate with people. And the end result is what we call the inherent complexity of growth, the inherent complexity that's taken on as companies grow. And what's happened now to our example organization is that it's grown in size and complexity. Now, an important thing to note is that complexity doesn't come just from the number of things that you have in an organization. It comes from the interaction of those things, the way that people, processes, and equipment interact with each other to utilize things like documents to conform to regulations. All of those things and the number of different interactions add to the level of complexity. And because the interactions grow far more rapidly than the number of things, complexity grows exponentially, even if the company is growing linearly. The implication of this is pretty important because complexity introduces 2 things that should be of pretty big interest to anybody in this webinar: cost and risk. We hear a lot about risk, and I'll clarify that when I talk about risk, I'm not talking just about the risk of somebody getting injured as we traditionally think about it. Risk in the sense of a management system refers to the risk of any desired outcome not occurring as desired, or of any undesirable outcome occurring. So for instance, not only is it people not getting injured, but it's also the risk of not meeting your production targets or productivity targets, the risk of environmental and other sorts of incidents. So there are a lot of different types of risks that are introduced, and these risks grow exponentially. Meanwhile, the value of continuing to grow diminishes over time. So what we find is that there are now very few companies left in a position where they can continue to grow and find additional value while incurring very minimal increase in cost and risk. Many companies are now at the point where if they continue to grow, they might add more value, but they're going to incur cost and risk at a much higher pace. And many companies that we work with are now past this threshold where they are now encumbered by a significant level of cost and risk, and further growth actually diminishes profitability and increases their chances of having an incident. And the reason we're talking about cost and risk is that this brings us back to the term of management systems, because management systems are the way that companies manage their risk. Now, before we go farther, I'm going to pause here for a minute and talk about and define what is a management system. This is one of those terms that if you were to ask 10 people what is a management system, you'll likely get about 11 different answers. And if you boil it down to a very simple definition, management systems are simply a collection of management processes that a company uses to manage its people, value chain processes, and equipment in order to achieve a particular outcome or set of outcomes. Now, I don't have time today to dive too deep into the difference between management processes and value chain processes. It's an important distinction, and if you're interested, I can certainly provide more information. But for the time being, the important thing to consider is that a management system is a collection of processes. And what we're going to really be focusing on today is how do those management systems fail? And they can fail for several reasons, but keep in mind we're talking in the context of fail to manage complexity and the associated risk and cost. If we were talking about management systems simply in the sense of, an objective being to seek compliance or obtain a certification for ISO, our conversation would be pretty short because there are not that many ways to fail at that. But if we're talking about using management systems to really control our cost and risk and complexity, there are many ways that this can fail. And we're going to focus today just on some of the three most common ones that we see, starting with the formality of the system. Now, whether a company is large or small, it doesn't matter the industry. Every company has a management system. The only question is how formal it is. Is it informal or formal? The distinction here, it comes down to how explicitly those management processes are identified, defined, documented, and purposefully managed. Every company has a management system because every company has those management processes. If you think about every company has people, right? Well, any company that has people needs to ensure that its people are trained. And the question is that process for training those people, for identifying who needs to be trained, for ensuring that the program or training materials is sufficient, for verifying that they've been trained, for identifying new things they need to be trained on, how formally is that done? Is it simply left up to everybody to kind of figure out on their own, or is it done in a very formal fashion? And the important thing is that when we're talking about an environment of high complexity, we need to recognize that informal systems are inherently inadequate for managing risk in a complex environment because they lack the clarity, the necessary processes, definitions, and distinctions necessary to cut through that complexity and adequately manage that risk. And there's many systems out there that seem to be formal. They sell themselves as formal systems, but they're really informal in nature. And the reason is because you think of management systems as kind of an iceberg, and the visual part of the iceberg is many times is the document, the management system framework, those nice looking books that companies publish. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on the documentation, how well things are documented and managed. And certainly information management and document management are important. But there's systems out there that focus primarily on document and information management and sell themselves as fully integrated management systems. But really, they're focused just on one of the processes and ignore the rest of the iceberg. And if we think of a management system as a collection of processes, we realize that many of those systems are really informal in nature and just focus on formalizing one particular aspect. So a common solution or an easy solution to this is, well, if informality is bad and formality is good, well, let's adopt a formal management system. And If you were to choose to do that, there are many options for you today. You can pick management systems for any number of outcomes that you want to manage, whether that be occupational health and safety, environmental management, quality management. There's systems out there specifically for managing employee engagement or managing public relations. It really, whatever you want, you will likely find a management system, a formal management system out there. And these have become very popular lately, as I mentioned, but we're also seeing that they tend to fail for the same reason. And that reason comes down to how they're organized. Many of these management systems are organized around an outcome. For instance, safety, environmental, quality, etc. And each of these management systems introduces what we'll call key controls, or that's really another word for the processes used to manage towards that outcome. And the problem is that a lot of these processes or key controls overlap. If you think back to the example earlier of training, well, what do you have to do to train people in order to identify unsafe practices? Well, you have to make sure that you have a process in place that can identify what people need to be trained on, to develop enough or sufficient materials to train them, to verify that they've been trained correctly. And what do you have to do to ensure people are trained to deliver quality products? Well, it's the same thing. And what happens a lot of times is these systems are implemented separately, and they separately introduce these processes that end up duplicating and overlapping each other. And certainly this introduces, some inefficiency to the system, but more importantly, it separates the processes and adds ambiguity, which really handicaps the ability of the system to manage that risk. And at the end of the day, what these systems do is they add more complexity. And we all know you can't fix an issue of complexity by adding more complexity to it. So one of the things that companies are doing now is they're recognizing this issue, and they're moving towards the approach of utilizing a single integrated management system, or what we call an operational excellence management system. Operational excellence management system is simply taking all of those key controls that you need for all of the desired outcomes and grouping them under a single system. And this is definitely the trend, especially lately. We've seen even traditional organizations like ISO now, when they recommend that people adopt their systems, they do so by recommending that you implement it under the sense of a integrated management system. You can pick and choose their different standards, but they recommend that you do it with one central system instead. So now we're moving, right? We've recognized that if we're going to implement an OEMS or management system, we need to make sure it's a formal one. And if it's a formal one, we need to make sure that it's a single system. It's organized around multiple outcomes, but with unique key controls to avoid adding additional complexity. But this still doesn't move us far along in our journey to avoid pitfalls, because we've even seen many companies start with a very fundamentally sound OEMS system and still fail pretty drastically. And that brings us to our third point of how OEMSs can fail, or management systems can fail, in that they succumb to the deep-rooted symptoms of complexity. In order to illustrate this point, I'll tell you the story about this picture. Some of you might have seen this picture on the internet. It's been going around. This picture is the result of a study performed by a professor of psychology from Scotland. And what he did is he surveyed 2,000 people, and he asked them, hey, what car do you think has the best headlights, for instance? Or what car do you think has the best wheels, or the best engine, the best interior? And he combined all of the responses into what he deemed as the universally perfect car, because it had the most consensus around what was ideal. And really the end result is this hideous fish-looking thing in front of us. And this illustration might seem pretty funny, but this is in reality what happens to a lot of management systems as they get implemented into an organization. Because when you implement a management system, it really matters how you do it. And unfortunately, when companies start, even if they start with a solid OEMS platform, a common outcome is that instead of the system molding to the requirements of the outcome, the system itself is mutated in a way to reflect those existing systems or practices, and many of those might be highly political, bureaucratic, or inconsistent, and the OEMS is then changed to match what we already have. And that, of course, renders the management system ineffective, because all it's really doing is formalizing those current practices and giving them a new lease on life. This is why the process for creating an OEMS for your organization has to be different. It has to be deliberate and calculated to preserve the crucial elements of your system while allowing sufficient flexibility to mold to the unique needs of your different organizations. And you'll hear Barb and I talk about this four-step process a little bit later on, and I'll circle back to it. I just wanted to introduce it right now, what we call the four-step process, which starts with discover, then design, develop, and deploy for a management system. We'll go through the question and answer with Barb, and I'll circle back to this at the end and give you some key things to think about with regards to each of these four steps in your journey.
Now we'll come to the discussion with Barb that we've all been waiting on. So I'm going to hand it over to her. She's going to start by giving us an overview of the roadmap for Suncor, and then we'll get into the question and answer session. So Barb, go ahead.
Thank you, Francisco. So what this slide is, it's some of the highlights of the key things that were done at Suncor to progress the management system and the culture and to enable operational excellence. It's not in the exact order that they were done, and it's certainly not exhaustive. So let me start with kind of where I started, was when the two large companies merged and they had multiple management systems. One of the first things that was done was to create one management system. What was done is we defined and deployed it. So when you think about Francisco's summary of define, discovery, design, develop, and deploy, for this management system what we did was design and deploy. Then over the next couple of years, there were self-assessments that were happening across the various assets. Governance was established. I should temper that a little bit to say that formal governance was established. There was informal governance, and about 2 years in, we established formal governance from the site level right to the executive level. Operational discipline, this is the culture part, doing it the right thing the right way every time. That was defined for this company, and again, every organization will define that culture that suits their organization, and this was defined for Suncor about 3 years into the program. Then there was the first management review, 2 to 3 years in. Operational excellence metrics and management system metrics were defined about 3.5 to 4 years in. Standards governance was established, and again, it was really updated. There was a form of standards governance, but we recognized that it was not helping the management system. In effect, it was confusing our operations organization. Management system version 2, we can talk about that a little bit more later, but really we're into the 5-year cycle now, and some things that we did around the management system to update it, make it easier for operations to use. And by virtue of establishing standards governance, we also created the opportunity to rationalize the standards. Every standard costs money, and so we rationalized the standards about half of what they were prior to having the governance established. And then a key thing here is to integrate the management system, operation, execution, prioritization with regular business planning. So it's not a separate project, it's not a separate program, it's part of how things are done. Then we did some culture assessments, so get a better understanding of where the culture was. Again, a little bit of that discovery stage, a bit late in the process, but and just some different mechanisms that we did to use to try and get a sense of where the culture was. And then the assurance roadmap, a better linkage and understanding of how audit and the management system needed to play for them to be successful. Again, a bit late in the process. There are many other deliverables and improvements, and overall I would offer that Suncor has made tremendous progress, and the management system and the culture, it has a great foundation from which they'll continue to grow and continuously improve.
All right, thank you for that great summary there, Barb. What we want to do now is switch over to the Q&A session, and I've got a few questions prepared for Barb, and if we get any more questions, we'll add those to the list as well. Let's start off by talking about some of the key challenges that Suncor faced. Obviously, there's challenges with getting the system designed correctly, but more in line with the adoption and getting buy-in from everybody. What kind of challenges or key challenges did you face early on in this journey?
There was probably two key challenges that we faced. One was that many parts of the organization were well on their way to deploying their version of the management system from both sides of the organization, and certainly process safety as a management system also had a very strong implementation program. So what we had to work our way through over time was the mapping. So we're going to ignore the new management system and just map what we're currently doing to it, and then it looks like we're doing it. And it took us a couple years to get through that. The second one, and anybody who does anything has experienced this comment, we are different. So we have a wide range of operating scenarios and operating assets, from mining to offshore to onshore to refineries. And of course there are differences at the standard and control and at the site level, but at the organizational level, the management system is applicable to all. So getting people to be okay with that, the management system would enable and allow these differences.
So thank you for that overview, Barb. Looking at those challenges that you faced and your overall journey, are there any key things that you maybe would have done differently if you had a chance to go through that journey again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always temper that. Hindsight's 20/20. I would offer that at the time I didn't know what I didn't know. We didn't know what we didn't know. And so at the time, I don't think we could have changed the order. But if I had a do-over, certainly at the design stage, doing design, it's really, if you get it right the first time, you're in heaven. But if you don't get it right, you really struggle to get it changed. And in our design, we used 120 very smart people, but with that number of people, the result was a lot of overlaps and inconsistent language across the management system, which created a little bit of confusion and cost for the sites, and perhaps slowed down some of their implementation process. And the other part I would do differently, in addition to having fewer people involved in the design, I would not just send out the books. I wouldn't just design and deploy. I would do a little bit more in the develop stage. So, and in particular, I would have established the governance early so that it's clear who's providing the focal point for translation and understanding of the management system, and who has the authority to make those calls and to document those calls. So those are the two key things that in 20/20 hindsight, I certainly would have done differently.
Those are great points, Barb. And you mentioned earlier on that Suncor did a version 2 of its management system. And can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, what things you wanted to change with your initial version, and then how far you took that change for version 2?
For the initial version, we do have, I would say it's not mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive, but for version 2, the key constraint for us was not to get in the way or to impede the progress, the great progress that operations was making in the deployment of the management system. And so if we made significant changes, that would cause a pause to operations. So we really constrained what we did to get value, which was to normalize the language, which made the management system easier and clearer and more consistent for the receivers. Eliminate duplication. We had some areas where we had a requirement in one that was repeated in another, so that created a duplication of work as well. And we implemented some changes of decisions that were made at the executive level. So it was very constrained in a way that our focus was to make it simpler, make it easier to deploy, but not to get in the way of operations work as it was. So the result was we had about 50% fewer words, which in its own right reduces confusion, and we took about 25% requirements out as well.
Oh wow, that's yeah, that's pretty substantial changes.
It was, and the second part that we did for version 2 is we used a very small central team and wrote the first draft, so not 120 people, but like 3, and created the first draft, because again, we weren't materially changing it, and so the rules around reducing conflicting or inconsistent language and duplicate requirements, a small central team did that, and then went through the governance structure and worked with the key stakeholders to own it and review it and assure it was consistent with their view of their elements.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you're doing this, you're redesigning your management system, involving less people. What role did senior leaders play in all of this? I mean, obviously, you still had to have buy-in from the organization for a management system that now involved less people in its design.
Yeah, we used the governance structure, and during this time, it also became apparent that decision-making was a little bit unclear. The senior leaders, we believed, had the decision-making rights, but what we had not clarified is that every single site had decision authority, so if they didn't like the change, they could veto it. So we had to go through the process of understanding what that was, and we were very fortunate at this organization that the senior leaders created a very small group of operating SVPs that could make the decision around the management system. And so as a result of this process, we recognized that decision rights were unclear, and we were able to clarify it, and also had the advantage of a very small operating group who at the end of the day could say yay or nay and move it forward. It still took us a year, because that's the unfortunate part of discovering that you had lack of decision right clarity in the middle of it. But at the end, the senior leaders were the ones that said, yes, this is our management, and it's what we've asked for, and let's go.
That's great. And is there, besides changing the management system, is there one thing you can look back on and point to as maybe the single most important, or maybe there's two, but one of the most important things you made to progress the OEMS, once you got it redesigned? What was a key change in your approach to implementing it?
Great question. The key change in the approach was really the pull versus push. And by that I mean we had started with a view that we were going to create a large project in the center and push that out, gather all the gaps from all the sites and put them in a big spreadsheet, and we were going to run this program to move the management system forward. And that just was not working. And when we changed it, said, we don't have the authority, the capacity at the center to understand what the risks and value is at each site. Each site has a different level of maturity around managing the risks, and so the management system would have a different implementation or deployment program at each site. And when we stopped trying to run it from the center and said, operations, your call. You tell us what your program is. You tell us what your state of risk management is and how you're going to progress it. You get approval for it. You own it. And we're going to monitor it because we need to have visibility to it, but we're certainly not going to drive it from the center. And when it became that operations, including the senior leadership, who in the small SVP group, they would make decisions that needed to be across the organization, but at the site level, they had complete authority and accountability for managing the deployment based on their risk and value. That really changed the view, the ownership, and the progress of the management system.
Very interesting. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to handle that, and that's a very interesting take on it, which obviously was a successful switch. And you know, I'm going to ask you now, one of the things that you mentioned in your journey, but we haven't talked about yet, was culture. And I did notice that culture appears a little bit later in the roadmap than it does for other companies. Can you talk a little bit about the culture and your approach to integrating culture into the solution?
Sure. Culture was an interesting one. My previous experience with management system was in a culture that was very much aligned with an operational discipline culture. And nobody talked about culture in that organization because it was so ingrained. And so when you bring two companies of the size that came together in this case, they had very different cultures. And so at some point we recognized that, hey, wait a minute, the culture might be part of the important part of making this work. And so it's a, you know, I feel a little bit badly that we didn't get into it until year 3, but at the same time, I don't think we recognized it early on, and I don't think we could have said, oh, we need to change a culture earlier on. I think it needed to be at the time when we started to recognize it and have the data to support it. And so it was a little bit late, and we do recognize certainly now that it is a critical piece, and it's treated like a very critical piece. But I just don't think we were ready for it earlier, and so it is where it is and is progressing very well in the organization today.
Yes, that's a very interesting point there, Barb, about culture. You know, every company obviously has a different point of view about culture, and they're in a different situation and requires a different approach. And you know, kind of wrapping up our Q&A session here, one last question I have. You know, going back to you pointed out a lot of good things to consider throughout your entire journey. What advice would you have for a company that's beginning this journey, starting to consider adopting an integrated management system?
Yeah, I would. That's a great question. Again, I would just couch this a little bit to say that a do-over is a luxury, and hindsight's 20/20. But if I was starting fresh today, I would offer the very first thing I would do is do more work around discovery. We didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't know until halfway in that the standards and the governance needed work. We didn't know that audit wasn't totally like engaged in terms of how it should look for the management system. So had we done a bit more discovery, you have to know what you're doing to do discovery. Again, if you don't know what you don't know. But we would have laid out a plan that would be more knowing. It doesn't mean we would have done it in a different order, but at least we would have done it in a way that we knew that we were going to incur more cost or more churn by delaying dealing with that aspect. Again, you can only deal in little chunks. The second part is the design piece. Again, we talked about that earlier. Smaller groups, experts, you really only get one chance to do it right. In the develop area, on version 2, we did do more development. We did get better alignment on scope and objectives and stakeholders and timeframes, and we built more products that would help the organization understand and work with the version 2. But getting that development piece, getting that alignment early is a very important part. And finally, on the deploy, clearly the pull versus push was very successful for Suncor and continues to be. And to your point earlier as well, Francisco, about delivering small chunks. We had some time where we tried to get a bit too heavy on the instantaneous perfection. Let's get it perfect. And what we discovered is, if you get something that covers the high issues that everybody can agree on, you get that out there, you get that value right away, and you can continuously improve it. And of course, getting the culture included a little bit earlier, I think in hindsight that's good. I don't think the organization was ready, but at least a better awareness that we needed to get to that, I think would have been a good thing to have early.
Right. Those are, thank you for that response. And got one last question here that we got submitted that has to do with measuring performance. And it asks, how do you know that your integrated management system is working and delivering value? What are the metrics that link the management system directly to performance?
So Francisco, that's a great question. Metrics played a key part for us early on. Is we did run the management review, and the management review started to create the energy and the questions around, well, what do we measure and how do we know, and that very question about how do we know that this thing is of any value at all. And so that created visibility to some measures, in particular conformance measures. Like with any system, if the system isn't in control, if you don't have conformance to it, if you're not actually using it, then to use it to measure progress, more than progress, but more results is very difficult to do. So the key one we focused on at the early stage of our maturity was just getting conformance. Are the operating and safe work practices being reviewed? Are the site process hazard analysis being done? And that visibility created opportunities for closing some of those gaps. And then as those were closed, then we could get into more specific detail around, oh geez, when we look at all these, now that we know we're recording these loss of containment type of incidents, can we now look in more detail and see, what is creating them? Is it an asset issue? Is it a people issue? And so we were able to see the progress of the measures. And a key thing that was done at the enterprise level was setting the enterprise metrics around safety and op costs and return on investments that we were focused on, that were going to be how we would know if we were operationally excellent. So all of those things put together started to create a maturity, and I would say, again, continuous improvement. Every year, as management review reveals more about where we are with the management system and what we're seeing in terms of results and opportunities, the measures will be refined, and they'll move more from conformance, which will be an expectation, now to more to the results side. Does that answer the question, Francisco?
Yeah, and I would probably add, from what I know of your approach, a couple of things that you did differently too, that were very valuable. Was you defined what success looks like, and it wasn't defined by the completed implementation of the management system as if it were a project.
Exactly.
There was a clearly defined end goal that was linked to performance metrics for the entire organization. So that made it very clear for everybody what the end goal was. It wasn't just about getting this implemented and checking the box. And then the other thing that I think you guys did very well, and many companies hesitate to do, was you started measuring early on. Once again, you didn't wait until everything was implemented to start measuring. You started measuring conformance, which is very important, but you also started testing your metrics. You once again, back to your point about continuous improvement, even in the way you were measuring the system, you were looking to continuously improve and refine those metrics so that over time, your understanding of how to measure conformance, how to measure performance and effectiveness improved with it. So I think those allowed everybody to have a very clear picture of what the end goal was and how you were doing towards achieving that, which worked very well.
Very good points, Francisco. Thanks for bringing those in.
The final question that I've got is, I get asked a lot what the role of senior leaders should be in the overall journey, development, implementation of the management system, along with how to get senior leaders bought into this. Can you speak to some of that a little bit?
That's interesting, Francisco. When you look at the roadmap and the things that we chose to highlight, you don't see getting senior leader buy-in and commitment. And at Suncor, very fortunate that the CEO and the executive leadership team, there was never any question. There will be one management system. They are totally behind it. They totally believe in it. There was no expectation of a big business case to make it happen. Not that there isn't value or that doesn't have to happen, and it does, and it will continue to, but the senior leaders were very, very committed. And so for many people that, I've talked to my colleagues, and that's a bit of a stumbling block for them, but at Suncor that is not in question. From the CEO on down, senior leaders believe in, support, and are committed to one management system.
Yeah, that's a great benefit to have. How did you see that translate down into the management system development? Because obviously, you can start with senior leader commitment, but many companies find that as soon as they start having some issues or encountering some roadblocks or getting pushback from business units, that senior leaders' commitment starts to wane a little bit. Did you see that, or what did the senior leaders do to prevent that from happening?
At the senior leader level, it shows up at every executive conversation. Whenever there's employee calls, it shows up. But to your point, we did have to create some enablers in there. We had to create a much clearer definition of what operational excellence meant. We had to create a clear definition of what the management system meant. So the senior leaders' commitment meant that people in the levels below that initially were not committed. That because the senior leaders' commitment remains steadfast and remains steadfast today, the listening was better, and the opportunity to provide more enablers that clarified what all OEMS, the management system, and culture was. The listening was much better. Leaders were looking for it so that they could better buy in and understand what they were committing to. So I would say that, first of all, the senior leader commitment never waned and has not waned to this day. And it enabled the conversation to continue deeper into the organization so that leaders could and would commit because they knew they had to.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Those are great points, and it's incredibly important. It's easy early on to get senior leaders bought in at some organizations, but the real challenge is for those senior leaders to have such a clear vision of what they want and understand that you're going to get some challenges. That this isn't going to be something that's one and done in a year, and so that knowing those challenges, they're able to keep communicating that, to keep repeating the message and translating it down to everybody, so that they know that this is a journey. They know that that leaders are committed, that that they're committed through even times where you have to redo things that you've already done, and ask people to once again commit some of their time and effort to this. So definitely commendable there for Suncor.
All right, well, thank you, Barb. And to kind of recap on some of the things that I talked about and that Barb mentioned, she mentioned a lot about their journey, the journey that Suncor went through in developing the management system. She mentioned some of the steps that she felt were very important. So I just want to give everybody a couple of key things to summarize what we talked about related to these steps. First is back to discover. It's important to understand the current state first. She mentioned you don't know what you don't know. Well, you have to find that out first, and the reason for this is because some of the things that you need to find out will play a part in designing the management system to work within your organization. Like the unique processes that you need, how it's going to be organized, how it needs to be governed, what systems are already out there that need to be integrated within the management system, what things might be replaced by the management system. It's also important to understand the cultural situation and barriers. Now, at Suncor, we talk about how this wasn't as big of an issue, but you don't know that going in. And I've encountered other clients where we started down the path of designing a management system and found that the cultural barriers were great enough to warrant starting with the culture first and then looking at the management system later, because the culture was such that no matter what solution we developed for the management system, it wasn't going to work under the current culture. So it's important to understand that first, along with defining the size of the prize. You heard Barb talk about the importance of getting people to believe in this, to adopt it. They've got a lot of different things going on, and one of the things that helps is defining the size of the prize. But I'm not talking just about the financial benefits to the organization. Certainly that's important. You have to be able to justify this project financially, but even more importantly, you need to be able to show people how their job, how their life will be better because of the management system. That's how you get people to change, is by showing them that this is a means to a better end for them, not just to the bottom line. Next, we mentioned design, the importance of how you design the management system. Barb said this is one of those things where you really only get one shot at it, maybe two, but it's not something that you want to go back and change every year, at least not significantly. So a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, keep it simple. This is something that's very easy to overcomplicate. And one of the ways to keep it simple is focus on avoiding overlap and duplication. Especially if you are working off of a management system that is being adopted from somebody else or one of the external systems that we saw. And this is where it can become very tricky, because there's a tendency to take a management system and, as you think about the governance for it, try and divvy it up according to how you're currently set up. And just because you, for instance, have two different groups right now that oversee risk identification, for instance, that doesn't mean you need two different processes for doing risk identification or two different owners for it. Be very careful in how you set this up, because overlap and duplication doesn't just mean a less efficient system. It actually severely handicaps the effectiveness of the system. And lastly, avoid rework by getting alignment early on. We talked about the importance of getting the right people in the room, talking about this early on. This is where the discover phase comes in and giving you those insights into what things to consider in discussing this with the right people. And it's important to have those discussions, but also draw a line in the sand and get to a point where you can move forward and make a decision. So the next thing is the development of the system. Barb mentioned that in their experience, they kind of skipped over this and went back and did it later. And this is actually a pretty common thing, because most people think of design the management system, I'm going to create the framework, I'm going to create this nice looking document, and then it's ready for everybody. But there's a critical step there in between of developing the management system and further developing those processes and the documents that are going to be used to communicate the expectations to everybody. And in doing that, it's important, once again, to engage the right people, but not engage everybody. This isn't an exercise in achieving consensus from the entire organization. It's important to get the right people in the room to work on the right problems. And that brings me to the second point of working in bite-sized chunks. When you finally start getting the stakeholders bought on into the idea of a management system, what you're going to get is, on one side, they've got all these issues that they've been dealing with for many years, and they're going to see the management system on the other end as a means to correcting all of those issues that they've had to deal with. And a common temptation is to try and close that gap entirely right away, to create those processes, for instance, very robust, because we see all these issues come up all the time, and we need to be able to correct them. And this is something where you have to be very careful and consider the amount of change within the organization. The first thing to do is to get people used to working systematically. Once you do that, you can then focus on moving them along in the right direction. Now, you need to move them, but avoid trying to solve all of the issues at once. And finally, in development, also, we talked a lot about, Barb mentioned several times the importance of governance. This is, once again, one of those things that parts of the iceberg that people don't really see or don't consider early on, but it's critical, not just for the design, development, implementation of your management system, but for the ongoing sustainment and improvement of your system. It's important to understand who's going to own this thing, how is it going to be divvied out, how is it going to be supported and managed, who's going to have input at which points, and how are we going to make decisions in the development. Once again, if your current decision-making framework is based off of politics or whoever can speak the loudest, that's going to be reflected in how the management system is developed. So it's important to proactively establish the right governance for this process and ongoing sustainment of your management system that doesn't involve any current issues with governance. And last, not least, is deployment. First thing is pace. Pace is extremely important, and it's an issue of balance. You can go too fast and you can go too slow. It depends on your organization, but the key thing is to consider pace and to manage it proactively, because if you let this become a process that's going to take 5 to 10 years for anybody to see a change, it's going to fall apart. People are going to forget about it and move on. But also, this is a significant change, so it's important to manage the pace at which it's deployed. You heard Barb talk about push versus pull. This is a very important thing to consider. Some companies I've seen take a voluntary approach to deployment where everybody can choose whether to adopt the management system or not. And on the other side, I've seen companies that take a very authoritarian approach where they are going to make all of the decisions centrally and push it all out to everybody. And once again, this is one of those things where it's a balance. You need a delicate push from the center to push things out, to move people in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it's the business units that own the risk and that most closely understand the magnitude of that risk, where that risk lies, in order to correctly pace themselves and prioritize the actions that they need to take. The priority for how to implement this management system and the sequence of events will look very different at different parts of your organization. And then finally, focus on continuous improvement. This is an exercise of getting people used to continuous improvement. And that is true during development, but also later on in the life of the management system. So keep that in mind as you go through this. Think about how you're going to take this management system and manage it, assess it, review it, identify issues that need to change, because the truth is we could develop a perfect management system for you today if such a thing exists. But in 5 or 10 years' time, it may no longer be perfect because your company is going to change. The processes that work today will not work down the road in 10 years. So you need to think about how the management system is going to continuously improve and change with your company. And with that, we will conclude it. I thank everybody once again for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Barb, for joining this conversation. And you will be getting a recording of this shortly. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Barb or myself, and we'd be happy to address them. Thank you once again, and have a good afternoon.